You spent 7 years in prison.
More than 7. So 7.5 the last time. 12 all total.
12 total.
7.5 the last time.
The opening question cuts into the past like a sharp blade. Blood, tears, and the spotlight. Charles S. Dutton, from a 17-year-old murderer to a television star followed by all of America. From a dark solitary cell, not every Hollywood star emerges from the spotlight. Charles S. Dutton was different. His path began in the darkness of prison from a teenage brawl at 17 that ended in death and a heavy sentence. Few could have imagined that this very stain would open a journey that transformed him from a killer into a television star. So what truly happened in that fateful moment? And how could the cold prison bars lead to the dazzling lights of Raqqa? On a summer night in 1968 in Baltimore, a brawl that seemed harmless changed the course of an entire life. It was not a movie scene. It was real. A teenager of just 17, hot-headed with fists hardened by the streets, and a childhood spent slipping through alleys filled with violence. When the dust settled, one man lay motionless, and the one left standing breath heavy was Charles Stanley Dutton. That fatal blow turned a reckless boy into a murderer in the eyes of the law. From that moment on, every light of the future was instantly swallowed by the darkness of prison. Charles was born on January 30, 1951, in a poor neighborhood of Baltimore, Maryland. Trouble was no stranger to his family. The men around him, from his father to his uncles, were all hellraisers, rebels accustomed to life outside the law. Young Charles grew up in chaos, often skipping school, joining fights. In reality, he served only about 3 years before being released. But freedom was short-lived. A few months later, Charles was arrested again for armed robbery. Once more, he returned behind bars, this time for a much longer stretch. Prison fights in defiance of discipline added years to his sentence. A brawl with a guard, which according to him ended with a handshake after a fair fight, seemed settled. But the federal authorities did not overlook it. 3 more years were added. Counting all cumulative sentences, Charles's life behind bars stretched to a total of 12 years, long enough to bury every dream. In a later interview, Dutton uttered a chilling line, "I got 3 years for killing a black man and 8 years for punching a white man." It was more than a recollection. It was an indictment of the injustice rooted in the American legal and prison system. A murder took away 3 years, but a punch stole 8. For Charles, those years were not merely punishment. They were a living scar of a society rife with prejudice and violence. Life behind bars was nothing short of hell. At Maryland prison, he often defied orders, refusing to work for just 35 cents a day. His defiance landed him in solitary confinement, where he was allowed to take only 1 book. And it was there, between cold stone walls, that he stumbled onto a new path instead of The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, which he had intended. Charles mistakenly picked up an anthology of plays by black playwrights. The sharp satire and laughter laced with bitterness made the rebellious prisoner laugh for the first time, and then awaken. It was a rare moment of clarity in the darkness. He decided that once released from solitary, he would gather the rowdiest inmates to form a theater group competing in the prison's talent program. Their play won first prize, and in the applause of an audience who couldn't leave their seats, because they too were inmates, Charles realized a truth he was born to stand on stage. Just when everything seemed sealed, when darkness confined him in a narrow, solitary cell, destiny arranged an unexpected turning point. What made a stubborn man change course was not a judge's lecture, nor the prison's iron discipline. It was simply a book mistakenly chosen. And from that moment, Charles was no longer just a survivor. He began his journey of rebirth. The story began when Dutton was punished with 6 days in solitary for refusing to work. In the American prison system, forcing inmates into menial jobs for a pittance was an unshakable rule. But Dutton would not comply. He flatly refused to sweep floors or scrub toilets for 35 cents a day. To him, it was not labor, but humiliation. His defiance immediately sent him to solitary, a punishment many considered the harshest. 6 days in a cold cell, no one to talk to, nothing to do but face himself. By regulation, each inmate in solitary was allowed 1 book. Charles intended to take The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, the revolutionary manual deemed essential for anyone calling himself a rebel. But fate seemed to test him. Instead of Fanon, he accidentally picked up an anthology of black playwrights. That mistake changed his entire life. In silence, he turned the pages. The sharp dialogue, the biting political satire. The stories, both bitter and humorous by Black playwrights, made him laugh. But standing on stage using his voice, his emotions, his presence to move others. From that moment, Dutton began to study seriously. In prison, he completed his GED, equivalent to a high school diploma, and continued with college courses. This education opened doors to more formal artistic activities. He transformed from a defiant inmate into the leader of a prison theater group, into someone who honed his mind and emotions to reach the hearts of others. The following years in prison were no longer just days of confinement. They became a special school where Dutton learned academics, learned self-control, and nurtured his acting talent. He said every time he stepped onto a prison stage, he felt truly alive, free, even when surrounded by bars. If in his youth Charles believed he was born to fight and break rules, then after solitary, he believed he was born to perform. That transformation was not easy. It required courage to admit mistakes, to open himself to beauty, and to believe that even a man who had killed could find the light. The story of solitary confinement and the fateful book is not just an interesting anecdote about Charles S. Dutton. It is proof of how a person can change through the smallest moments. 6 days in solitary, a brutal punishment, became the chance for an inmate to discover a lifelong passion. A book chosen by mistake opened the door to Yale School of Drama, to Broadway, to Hollywood, and ultimately to the career of an Emmy-winning artist. Charles S. Dutton once said, "If it weren't for the stage, I would have died in prison." That was no exaggeration. For him, art was not just a career, but a lifeline. It turned a 17-year-old murderer into an artist, with a voice in society. Debbie later admitted, he was never violent, never. But Charles carried too much darkness. Sometimes I felt like he was still imprisoned, even though he had left prison long ago. They are not just the story of an actor, but the manifesto of a man who rose from inmate to star and dared to challenge an entire system. So what remains, after all? Not only the Emmy statues, not only the sitcom Rock. Dutton's greatest legacy is spirit refusing to let the past define the future and refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. A man who once swore he would never bow in prison became a symbol of defiance in glittering yet prejudiced Hollywood. And when his story is told, people do not see just an actor, but a warrior who used art as his weapon. Perhaps his greatest legacy is not in Emmy statues or shocking scripts, but in the image of a man who once wore a prison uniform, now standing before the public to say, "The past cannot define the future. Only courage and truth can." At 73, Dutton has turned his life into a message, a living proof that people can change, that art can redeem, and that truth, even bitter, has t'all. If you've stayed with us until now, surely the story of Charles S. Dutton has touched you. A journey from the darkness of prison to the spotlight of the stage, from despair to an enduring legacy. And there are many more stories like this waiting to be told, secrets never before revealed behind Hollywood's glittering lights.